الدكتور روي كاساغراندا ضيف برنامج الليوان مع عبد الله المديفر.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله، حياكم الله في الليوان. الليلة حكاية خالد بن الوليد. في الليوان تتضح الحكاية. حياكم الله من جديد وباسمكم جميعا نرحب بضيفي الدكتور روي كاساغراندا. حياك الله دكتور.
Thank you so much.
الحمد لله على السلامة، سعيدين بوجودك معنا اليوم.
Thank you so much.
دكتور روي كاساغراندا أستاذ العلوم السياسية بجامعة أوستن، أمريكي الجنسية، مسيحي الديانة. لك أطروحة تقول فيها أنه خالد بن الوليد أحد أعظم 3 محاربين في كل العصور. لماذا وضعت خالد بن الوليد مع هؤلاء العظماء بأنه واحد من أعظم 3 محاربين على مر التاريخ؟
So Khalid ibn al-Walid was undefeated over the course of his career. He fought somewhere between 24, maybe as many as 50 battles. I don't think anybody has the exact number pinned down. And those battles, the sum of those battles was to completely transform the Middle East and to transform the world. His impact is as big, if not bigger, than the impact of, say, Alexander the Great. And his military career is at least as good, if not better, than that of Alexander the Great. So he definitely deserves to be up there. Historically, he's been forgotten, especially by Europe and North America. And I think that was deliberate. Like if you were to walk to any city in the United States and say his name, nobody would know who you were talking about. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be putting him in the top 3.
إيش أبرز صفات خالد بن الوليد العسكرية من خلال قراءاتك وتتبعك، الصفات العسكرية التي تراها في خالد بن الوليد كقائد عسكري؟
So the great military leaders do one thing really well, which is innovate. They change the way that they do warfare, they change the way that they do politics, they change the way that they govern. So in the case of Khalid ibn al-Walid, he was just a warrior, so he didn't have the other aspects. But like Tahutmos III, one of the others that I put in the top, he was a pharaoh, and so as a result, he was actually ruling Egypt while being a military leader. What Khalid does that's so extraordinary is he'll go into a battle and he'll change tactics from the battle that he did before. So I think it's our nature as humans we find something that works, we keep repeating it. And he was not attached to repeating his tactics. So I said somewhere between maybe 24 to 50 battles. Let's do the 24 just to be on the safe side. He maybe had 18 different tactics that he employed in each situation. From here, looking at what he did, it looks to me like he saw the battlefield as a puzzle, a problem to solve. And then he spent his time, in the planning process, trying to figure out how to take the enemy's advantages and use them against them, and make the enemy's advantage into a weakness. And in that level, I think nobody surpasses his abilities.
يعني تكتيكات مختلفة، تفكير غير تقليدي في معظم الحالات. أيضا يقال أنه كثير من المعارك اللي خاضها خالد بن الوليد يعتمد على الندرة البشرية، أن يكون جيشه أقل من جيش العدو، وفي هذه الحالة أيضا ينتصر. كيف يستطيع برأيك أنه ينتصر في أكثر من معركة، مع أنه قد تكون الجيوش 3 ضد 1، 4 ضد 1، أحيانا توصل إلى أضعاف عدد جيشه؟
Yeah, that's the mystery of what he was able to do, because he's outnumbered almost every battle by a very significant margin. Sometimes it's 15,000 to 20,000. That's reasonable. Sometimes it's much larger, 4 to 1, even higher. Well, so it's not just that. He's also fighting against heavy infantry and heavy cavalry. So he has lightly armored soldiers, lightly armored cavalry, and he's going up against these units that are very disciplined, very effective, heavy infantry units. They were like fighting fortresses. They could just move slowly towards you. And that's what he does so well, is he takes their strength and he turns it into a weakness, and he uses Arab mobility to compensate for their lack of mobility. He also, I think, as time went by, there was a little bit of extra added in that he developed such a reputation that he could arrive at a battle, and if they knew he was the commander, it immediately ruined their morale. But it took a lot to get there, right? That didn't happen right away. So in the beginning, the victories are really just him outthinking the enemy every step of the way.
تحتمس الثالث، هذا الفرعون المصري الذي يقال أنه وضع قواعد جديدة للحرب في العالم. يقال أنه ما كان في ميمنة وميسرة وقلب للجيش قبل تحتمس الثالث. ما هم، يعني أريد أن أعرف منك أكثر، لو ملخص بسيط عن تحتمس الثالث، هذا المحارب العظيم الذي خلد اسمه التاريخ.
So one of the problems that we have with Thutmose III is the ancient Egyptians didn't yet have the idea that they needed to record all the battles. They don't begin to do that really until Ramses II. And, you know, Ramses II is more than a century later. So there's a little bit of an information gap with Thutmose. We know that he fought 17 military campaigns. He fought in Palestine, Syria, he fought he fought in northern Sudan, he fought in Libya. He expanded Egypt and made it into an empire. In many ways, the queen before him, Hatshepsut, began to establish that empire. He took that empire to its height. In many ways, that's the world's first real empire. A state that controls more than the country that it set out to rule. It's now conquering other countries. But we don't know the details of his battles except a couple. So, for example, we know the Battle of Armageddon. The Hittites and their Semitic allies had formed a wall at the front of a canyon. And they expected him to come straight at the wall. And had he done that, he probably would have been defeated. What he did was he approached the wall, set up camp, and then during the night snuck around to the other end of the canyon and then came through the narrow canyon and attacked the enemy from the rear, catching them off guard. It was a very dangerous maneuver because if the Hittites had put defenders up at the top of the cliff, they could have literally just dropped rocks on the Egyptian army. But they didn't expect him to do this, and so he catches them off guard and wipes them out and wins the day. So we know that he was also, like Khalid, coming up with new tactics, but we just don't know enough. We only have a few details.
كثيرون معجبون بالملك الأقدوني الإسكندر الأكبر، لكن أنا أريد أن أعرف مثار إعجاب الدكتور روي بالضبط. الإسكندر وين المنطقة التي أثارت إعجابك أكثر من باقي المناطق عند شخصية الإسكندر العسكرية؟
So Alexander the Great, he also does this thing where he'll break the tactics of the time period. But I think he relied more on his personality. So his goal was to drive the morale of his troops up to a high level more than it was to get on the battlefield and do something new and innovative. Not that he didn't do new innovative things, he definitely did. It just that wasn't his thing. So there were times where he relied on the love that his men had for him. So I can give you an example of a battle. When they were trying to capture the city of Sur in what is today Lebanon, they had built a causeway to the city. There was a wall that surrounded the city. They kept trying to get over the wall, kept day after day after day after day. They couldn't make it. One day he grabs a ladder. He runs up to the wall. He sets it against the wall. He climbs the ladder. The defenders were surprised. All of a sudden, the general of the enemy is on top of the wall. He pulls out his sword. He looks at his men and he says, "If you love me, you'll save my life." And he jumps into the city alone. And of course, the men are so worried that they're going to lose this guy that they do finally get over the wall. It's dramatic and it's full of flourish and it's also probably crazy. And he pulls it off and he wins. And he'll conquer an empire through the force of his personality.
أريد أن أتعرف أكثر على وجهات النظر التاريخية التي تتبناها في سيرة معارك خالد بن الوليد تحديداً، ولكن في الجزء الآخر من البرنامج، لأني أريد أن أحتاج الشاشة، شاشة الليوان التي ستعرض جزءا من هذه المعارك وتفتح لنا جزء من هذا أو تستكمل من هذا الحوار. فاصل قصير أستأذنك فيه لنذهب إلى شاشة الليوان التي تنتظرنا ولا تنتظركم. لا تذهبوا بعيدا. حياكم الله في شاشة الليوان. نتابع الحديث مع الدكتور روي. دكتور، في شاشة الليوان ممتلئة بالمعارك هذه الليلة، ونريد أن ندخل معركة ومعركة ونسمع تعليقك على هذه المعارك. لنبدأ بأول معركة إن أذنت لي.
كسرناهم، لم يعد ما يدعو لبقائنا. نصيبنا من الغنائم. الزموا أماكنكم، لا تخالفوا عن أمر رسولنا، إنكم تكشفون الجناح الأيمن للجيش. خسرنا المعركة يا خالد، فالمجيشين قد انكسروا. ليس بعد.
معركة أحد في العام 625 كانت هي ثاني معركة بين جيش المسلمين بقيادة النبي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وبين جيش مكة. كانت البداية تتجه إلى انتصار للمسلمين على جيش مكة، ولكن كان هناك تحول مهم نسبه الكثيرون إلى خالد بن الوليد، الذي لم يكن قائدا وقتها قائدا للجيش، لكنه قائد الميمنة مع يعني عدد من الفرسان، وكان الجيش تحت قيادة أبي سفيان بن حرب. كيف تقرأ هذه المعركة من الناحية العسكرية؟
So yeah, the situation in the battle is that there's a space in front of a mountain, and the Muslims are going to defend it. They've got a hill that's separate from the mountain range, and they put archers up on the top of the hill, and then they defend the space between the mountains and that hill. And when the Meccans arrive, right, their goal is to just cut into that space and fight them. And in the beginning, it looks like the Muslims are going to win. Khalid has command of a cavalry unit that was ordered to just do the same thing that everybody else was doing. But as he's evaluating the situation, he realizes there's this really big weakness in the Muslim defense. And he also realizes that just advancing forward like everybody else was doing wouldn't achieve anything, wouldn't achieve a victory. So he takes the men around the hill and he comes up behind the Muslim army. And at that point, right, that's when you're outflanked in combat during those days, but even today, being outflanked is about the worst thing that can happen, and that's exactly what happened. At that point, the Muslim army is forced to retreat into the mountains.
هذه المعركة كان خالد بن الوليد ضد جيش النبي محمد، وبعدها أصبح في جيش المسلمين بعد أن دخل الإسلام. قد تكون معركة مؤتة هي من أوائل المعارك التي خاضها خالد بن الوليد مع جيش المسلمين. دعني أشاهد معك مقطعا من هذه المعركة في أحد المسلسلات.
العدو كثير والمعركة غير متكافئة والأمل بالنصر ضئيل،
بل مستحيل. فلتفكر كيف تنقذ المسلمين من عار الهزيمة وكارثة الإبادة، فما يزال هرقل في الخلف ومعه 100,000 أخرى.
أنت على حق. ينبغي الحفاظ على الجيش، ينبغي الحفاظ على المقاتلين، والحرب كر وفر. ابدأوا بتحريك الجيش.
مدد جديد.
في العام 629 رسول أو مبعوث من الرسول محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم اتجه إلى الغساسنة وقتل في حادثة لم تكن معتادا أن يقتل المبعوثين والرسل، مما اضطر أن يكون هناك الرسول أن يرسل جيشا ليقاتل الغساسنة وحلفائهم الروم في معركة مؤتة. حدثني عن هذه المعركة وعن دور خالد بن الوليد فيها.
Okay, so sometime between the Battle of the Trench, which was in 527, and Mؤtة, which is in 529, Khalid ibn al-Walid and Amr ibn al-As go to the Prophet Muhammad and they convert to Islam. So you're right, like Mؤtة is going to be the first time he fights for the Muslims. They go into what is today Jordan. There is a pretty deep valley that they have to cross through to get up onto this plain near the town of Mؤtة, and the Romans arrive. So when we say the Romans, it's a little tricky because there are Ghassanids, and the Ghassanids were Christian Arabs who were a vassal state of the Roman Empire. So the number of Romans that were with the Ghassanids was probably around 3,000 is my guess, and then the Ghassanids might have been 47,000. So we're talking about an army probably about 50,000. There are numbers that are much larger than that, but I tend to always go with the more conservative estimates. The Muslims brought 3,000 men, so 3,000 against 50,000 is not probably doable. The fighting begins, and you think, when you see the 50,000, you run away. You don't stay for the fight. But the Muslim army stayed for the fight. There were 3 people that were designated as commanders by the Prophet Muhammad. And one after the other, they die. And at that point, then the army literally doesn't have anybody in charge. There's a moment of chaos. Eventually, there's a person who...
يعني كان القائد الأول زيد بن حارثة، ثم جعفر بن أبي طالب، ثم عبد الله بن رواحة، وكلهم قتلوا. وكانت هذه التوصية بالتسمية من الرسول مباشرة. قتل عبد الله بن رواحة فلم يكن للمسلمين قائد. أكمل لي القصة.
Yeah, so they have nobody in charge, and there is a person who takes the flag, the banner for the army, and goes to Khalid and says, "You should be in charge." And I think in large measure it's because of his performance at Uhud. He takes command of the army, and his goal at this point is, there's no winning. His goal is to get the men out, which when you think about it is a really remarkable thing to want to even try to do because he's so badly outnumbered. So they go into this valley and they set up camp across from the Romans for the night. And what Khalid tells his men to do is instead of having one fire for every 5 or 10 men, each man makes his own fire. And then periodically the men would get up and they would walk around the fire. So it looked like there were a lot of people there. And it made the numbers look much bigger. So the Romans went, maybe we underestimated the number of men here. And so that's Khalid's tactic. He's trying to confuse the Romans on the
هل اعتقد الرومان انهم اكثر او انه جاءهم مدد، يعني مدد من الخارج؟
They were surprised that there were so many people there, and I think that's what the horse scene was with the torches. So then the next day in the morning, what Khalid does is he takes the banners from all the units, and he has the cavalry go down into a valley behind a hill so the Romans can't see. And he has them take one of the banners and they go around a hill and then they come up on top of the hill and then they go down again. And when they go down, most of the riders go back into the valley. But one guy goes up on top with the banner, or maybe a few guys go up on top with the banner. Then the cavalry that had just gone up over the hill takes another banner. They go up over the hill so the Romans can see them. They drop down in the valley. Most of them go back around, but a few go up on top with the new banner. They grab a new banner and then they go back around. And they keep doing this. So instead of it looking like there's 500 cavalry arriving, it looks like there's 5,000 cavalry arriving. So the Romans are beginning to think, oh, they're getting all these reinforcements. They had so many more men than we thought. So it's causing the Romans to hesitate. That night he does the campfire trick again, and then they run. They just abandon the fires and they take off into the desert. And by this point, the Romans are convinced the whole thing is a trap. And that if they pursue, they'll be ambushed. So they don't pursue, and that's how he escapes.
يعني خالد بن الوليد قرر انه يعني يحمي الجيش وينقذ الجيش وينسحب بدون خسائر. هذا الهدف اللي كان يريد الوصول اليه خالد.
I mean, I'm sure they had losses in the beginning, but yeah, under Khaled's command, they escaped them, which is amazing. Like, so it's technically not a victory, right? Because he didn't win the ground, but I think you can also count it as not a defeat, because they should have been wiped out.
والخدعة والإلهاء كانت هي التكتيك العسكري اللي اتبعها خالد هنا.
Yeah, in this case, the tactics are, how do I confuse the army on the other side just enough that they decide we shouldn't pursue. And so in that case, it's like psychological warfare.
أيضا يعني هنا خالد بن الوليد يعني لم يكن قائدا بالأصالة، كان قائدا بالنيابة. لكن في معركة أخرى، ومعركة من أهم المعارك، وهي يمكن أول المعارك كانت بين المسلمين والفرس، هي معركة ذات السلاسل. أريد أن نتحدث معك عن هذه المعركة.
I would love to, but before we do, let me say one more thing about
ماذا تريد أن تقول؟
It may have actually influenced a battle that takes place in 1862 in the United States. There was a cavalry general, Jeb Stuart, who decided that he was working for the Confederate States of America in the U.S. Civil War. He decided he wanted to encircle the Yankee army and go around them once. Ironically enough, his father-in-law was a cavalry general for the United States Army that was supposed to chase him and catch him. So it's son-in-law versus father-in-law. And at one point, the father-in-law had come up on his position, and he does the same thing with the banners. And he runs his men up and down the hill to convince the father-in-law there are more soldiers than there were. And the father-in-law hesitates, and he moves his men around in the hesitation. So I can't help but wonder if Jeb Stuart had read about this and then repeated that.
هل تظن أنه قرأ أو كلاهما يشتركان بنفس الفترة؟
It could be either way, right? Because he could have read it, or he could have invented it on the spot. Yeah.
أريد أن أواصل هذه المغامرة معك وأنتقل إلى ذات السلاسل.
لقد تم القبض على باقي عرب العراق الهاربين من التغليب. قيدوهم بالسلاسل كإخوانهم حتى لا يستطيعوا الفرار.
يعني في طموح المسلمين إلى التوسع وبداية فتوحات العراق، كانت ذات السلاسل هي مفتاح مهم. كانت، وتصحح لي إذا أنا أخطأت، في منطقة كاظمة في شمال الكويت. هذه المعركة حدثت في 633. كان خالد بن الوليد هو القائد. حدثني عن هذه المعركة المهمة في تاريخ الفتوحات الإسلامي.
So to begin, we need to kind of understand the situation. So in the entire history of the Arab people, they had never been unified in a single state. They had never been conquered by outsiders. You know, Yemen had been invaded by Ethiopia at one point, and the Persians owned much of the eastern part of Arabia, and the Romans owned the northwestern part. But the whole thing had never been ruled by a single leader. The Nabateans at one point had a state in the north, but the whole thing had never been ruled by a single leader until 633. In the aftermath of the Ridda Wars, Abu Bakr has conquered the entire Arabian Peninsula and put it together in 633. Instead of telling Khalid, okay, you've done an amazing job, you know, at Yarbu and Yamama and
بعد حرب المرتدين.
Exactly. Buzakha, all these different battles in the Ridda Wars. Instead of saying, okay, now is the time to consolidate our gains and let's take a rest, let's take a break, the Khalifa Abu Bakr says, keep going. And the next thing you know, they're invading the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire, in one way, shape, or another, had existed for 1,200 years. A person living at the time, if you had said to them, the Persian Empire will end, they would have said, you're insane, that's not possible. The Persian Empire had been a global superpower for more than a 1,000 years, and all of a sudden this army is invading. So I think in the mind of the Persians, they're like, oh, it's an Arab raid, this is a nuisance, but let's just go quickly put it down. Khalid actually wrote the Persian general a note, a letter, said, I'm coming, which of course is unusual. Usually you want to ambush the enemy. But the way he wrote the letter, it made it sound like he was going to Kazima in Kuwait. On the way to the city that the Persians had as a base was right near where Basra in Iraq is. So it looks like he's going that way. So Hormuz takes the Persian army to go to Kazima to block his path. So Khalid doesn't go to Kazima, he goes to Hufair, to the north of the city. Word then arrives from Hormuz scouts that Khalid has gone to Hufair, so Hormuz takes the Persian army to Hufair, but in the meantime Khalid has taken the Arab army to Kazima. They turn around and they come back to Kazima and meet Khalid there. The reason he did this elaborate maneuver was he wanted to take advantage of the fact that the Persians were heavy infantry. They had all this armor. So by the time they marched from Basra to Kazima, and then Kazima to Hufair, and then Hufair back to Kazima, they would be more exhausted than his men. And so they line up, a group of Persians chain themselves together, and then Hormuz challenges Khalid to a duel. It was very common for armies back then to have champion fight before anything happened. So by the way, also the Arabs like to shout poetry to the other side before a battle would start. So an Arab volunteers, he shouts some poetry, the Persians don't care, they're like, let's just get on with it. Hormuz challenges Khalid, they go out into the middle of the field, they fight. What Hormuz had done was he had moved a group of his best men forward a little bit, so that if he died, they were going to rush out and kill Khalid. Khalid kills Hormuz, and somewhere between maybe 6 to 12 Persian soldiers rush out to kill Khalid. And as they're charging at him, Qaqa ibn Amr, one of Khalid's lieutenants, goes, that's not fair. And he runs out, and the two men defeat the Persians that had come to kill Khalid, and then the battle begins.
كم عدد الفرس اللي انقضوا على خالد كخدعة كنوع من الخدعة؟
It was probably 6 is the low number, maybe as much as 12, somewhere in there. So with Qaqa, it was 2 to 6 or 2 to 12. Either way, it's ridiculous. Also, what were the other Arabs thinking? Like the rest of the army. Oh, Qaqa and Khalid, that's enough. We don't need to send anybody else. Like, why didn't somebody else go, yeah, it's still not fair, and rush out there? Which makes you realize how much confidence they had in those two men in that moment, that they thought, yeah, they got this.
وهذه أفضل بداية معنوية للمسلمين، لجيش المسلمين، وبداية سيئة للغاية لجيش الفرس. ما الذي حدث بعد ذلك؟
Yeah, so the Persians are exhausted. They've chained themselves together to show that they can't be moved. And also, you know, if there's a cavalry charge and there's a chain in between the two soldiers, it'll be very bad for the horse. So the Persian thinking is, we're heavy infantry, this will dissuade them from doing a cavalry charge, it'll show our resolve. But now they're demoralized because their general has just died, so they don't have any leadership. And then they attempted to cheat. There's no better way to describe it. And the cheat failed, even though they outnumbered Khalid and Qaqa by such large numbers. So their morale is shot, they're exhausted out of their minds, and then the battle begins, and the Arabs overwhelm them and defeat them.
كانت المعركة هذه لم تنتهي في لحظة واحدة، كان هناك معارك متتالية لملاحقة فلول الجيش في المدار وفي الولجة. ما الذي حدث في الولجة تحديدا شمالا في ملاحقة الفلول؟ حدث تكتيك مختلف يتحدث عنه المؤرخون العسكريون.
So there's Walajah, and then there's Ulais, and then I'm forgetting the next one. But there's a series of battles that they do, and what happens is Khalid goes up along the Euphrates on the west side. He's conquering the Lakhmid territory. The Lakhmid state had been a vassal state of Christian Arabs that served the Persian Empire, but they had recently been conquered or absorbed into the Persian Empire, and they were no longer autonomous. As he's moving along the Euphrates River, he does do multiple different tactics. In one battle, for example, he knows approximately where they're going to end up fighting, so he takes Dirar, one of his lieutenants, and he has Dirar take 2 cavalry units behind a hill. And then there's a larger mountain range behind where Khalid's going to place his forces. And then what happens is when the Persians deploy, they're ready to attack because they outnumber Khalid, but they decide not to. They're going to wait. So Khalid moves forward. He thought they would attack, but they didn't. He moves forward and starts fighting them, and then he starts to withdraw. And as he's withdrawing, he pulls his army back into a C shape, which draws the Persians in, and then Dirar takes the 2 cavalry units from behind the mountain, and they hit the Persians from behind. It's a disaster. And these are the kind of tactics that he keeps employing. Like he changes. It's not the same thing. And
يعني استخدم أسلوب الكماشة هنا إن صح التعبير.
He's using the terrain. He's looking at what the enemy is doing. When he saw that the enemy wasn't going to attack him, he drew them in. So he sort of lured them. And he sets up traps.
أيضا في العراق في عام 633 كان هناك مباغتات ليلية قام بها خالد بن الوليد كأسلوب آخر من الأساليب العسكرية. لو تحدثني عن هذا التكتيك الذي استخدمه في معارك أخرى، أعتقد في الزميلة أو في أماكن أخرى.
Okay, so he's got a strange situation. There's a Persian army, or there's 3 Persian armies. They're roughly 25,000 men each. And they're coming to attack him. By this point, he has Hira, he has Ain Tamr, he has multiple, he's conquered a huge chunk of Western Iraq. And he knows that there are these 3, his scouts have reported there are these 3 Persian armies coming. If they unify and attack him, he's got 15,000 men. They're roughly 70,000, 65, 70,000. They're going to outnumber him 4-1, almost 5-1. He's worried. He doesn't want them to get together. So what he does is he figures out their course. There are 3 water holes, 3 oases along the way that they're probably going to stop at during the night. So he calculates when they should arrive. He takes his army and he breaks it up into 3 units. His father-in-law, Abu Layla al-Minhal, takes command of one. The other one is going to be commanded by Qaqa ibn Amr. And then he's going to take the 3rd one. And what they're going to do is they're going to time the attack. First, Zumail, they're going to time the attack so that they arrive in the middle of the night at the same time. And they're going to attack.
يعني يتفرقوا ثم يأتوا إلى مكان واحد بنفس اللحظة.
They're going to go 3 different ways.
Okay.
And then they're going to arrive at the same spot, same time, same night. So to do this, they need some skill. So think about, imagine, if you will, that you and your friends want to go somewhere on a trip, but you're going to take 3 different paths. and you've got Google Maps and cell phones, and you're trying to coordinate this for you to arrive in the same location, odds are
صعب والله.
it's like
وهذا وانت واحد مو جيش يعني.
Now you imagine you have 5,000 man armies trying to converge on the same spot. And the way that they pulled it off was the Arabs knew the stars. The Arabs didn't just know the stars by looking at the constellations. They knew how to navigate using the stars to the point where they could get within maybe a meter of a location. So when he says, we're going to go to this spot here, they can do this because they can navigate at night using the stars, and they can get there at the exact time by looking at the angle of the stars and knowing the dates. And they converge, and they attack the Persians in their sleep. The Persian army tries to recover, but they're intense. They have to gather their weapons. They're sleepy. They're groggy. It's a disaster. Then they do it again at a place called Thania, and again the three armies arrive at the same time, the same night, and the Persian army was exactly where Khalid thought it would be, and they attack them, and it's devastating. There are people escaping, so some of the men that are escaping are getting to the third location, Masih or Muzeya. I've seen it both ways. I'm not sure which is the proper one. And again, three armies converge at the same time at night, and they destroy that army too.
كرروها مع الجيش الثاني يعني لم يعملوها فقط مع الجيش الأول، كرروها مع الجيش الثاني، لأنه أنت قلت لي قبل قليل 3 جيوش.
There were 3 armies, and they did Zumail, and then Sania, and then Muzeya. They did it 3 times in a row. And
وكم كان عدد الجيش اللي عدد الجيوش مجتمعة الثلاثة اللي قضوا عليها؟ هم 15,000 الجيش المسلمين، لكن هذوليك الجيوش الفرس كم كانت؟
The 3 armies were roughly 20 to 25,000 each, so they probably somewhere between 65 and 70,000 men. And not all of them were killed. Many of them escaped. Some of them were captured. But the losses were devastating. The 3 armies were basically destroyed.
من المعارك المهمة اللي حدثت أيضا في العراق هي معركة الفراض.
Yeah.
أريد أن أشاهد جزءا من هذه المعركة وأسألك عن هذه المعركة المهمة.
Okay. Yeah.
هكذا إذن إمبراطور الروم العظيم يدعونا نحن الفرس للتحالف معه ضد العرب. من كانوا بالأمس حراسا لحدود دولتنا أصبحوا اليوم هاجسا مرعبا لنا وللروم. يا للسخرية.
ما الأمر يا رستم؟ أجئنا لننشد أشعارا أم لنتخذ قرارا؟
لا تتردد يا مولاي، أرسل له بموافقتك فورا. فلربما كان ذلك مخرجا لهم ولنا ولو إلى حين، فمع العرب كل شيء وارد.
جيش خالد بن الوليد المنتصر يقابل الروم والفرس معا. كيف اجتمع الروم والفرس معا في مواجهة أو لمواجهة خالد بن الوليد؟
So Firad is where the border between the Roman and Persian empires is, or was. It's very close to actually where the Iraq-Syria border is today. And that's not a coincidence. When the British and the French they took out the napkin and the crayon and they began drawing lines on a map, they wanted it to be roughly where the Persian-Roman border was. The Romans and the Persians had been at each other's throats in conflict since 58 BC. So by this point, we're talking 680 years of not constant conflict, but mostly constant conflict. And so the Romans and the Persians hated each other's guts. And here they are at the border where they're supposed to be ready to fight each other at a given moment. And the Persians go over to the Romans and they say, look, we're having a really big problem here. There's 15,000 Arabs. They have managed to capture what is today Western Iraq. and we don't know that we can stop them. We need your help. And when you think about it, then this is maybe the first ever time that the Persians and the Romans are going to work together.
أول مرة في التاريخ.
Well, so it's kind of. So previously there had been a Roman emperor who had been murdered by a general who then took over and became the new Roman emperor. And the Persian emperor was furious because they had been friends. So that, it's not that there were never any periods of time where Persians and Romans couldn't get along. It's just that it was so rare. So to have the Persians and the Romans fight together against a common enemy was unimaginable. What Khalid does, again, because he's gonna flip the script, he's gonna do the opposite thing that you think. Instead of coming, because they're already on his side of the Euphrates River. So instead of approaching them directly, he crosses the Euphrates River and puts the river in between him and them. And then he goes to Firaz, but he's now on the north bank of the river, and they're on the south bank. And of course, they're surprised because they're expecting him to come from the other direction. And he parks at this spot. The reason Firaz was so important was you could cross the Euphrates on foot, and there was a bridge. So it was a great place for caravans to cross, for armies to cross. It's the, if you wanted to do that, you would do that here. So Khalid parks his army on the Euphrates River. And of course, the Romans and Persians are like, no, we're not going to fight you from the river. So he realizes they're not going to cross until he does something else. And he needs them to cross because he needs the river to be an advantage. And here's why. He's got 15,000 men. There's probably somewhere around...
كم عددهم هم المجمل الجيشين معا؟
Yeah, so the two armies combined are roughly 150,000 men. He's outnumbered 10-1. So he needs to use the terrain as much as he can in this circumstance. It's probably the reason he crossed the river was...
بس رقم مذهل يعني 15,000 ضد 150,000 مهمة شبه مستحيلة.
It feels impossible. Like it should have been impossible. This should have been the end of his army and him. But of course it's not going to be.
ما الذي حدث؟
So what he does is, he loved to do this, he breaks his army into 3 units, same commanders, Al-Minhal and Qaqa. And so they're at the river. That part of the river, the river bent, so there was like this natural curve. So what Al-Minhal and Qaqa do is they pull back away from where the bridge and the ford are. So when the Romans and the Persians, now that if they cross, they'll be over here, far away from them. And then what Khalid did was he took the infantry, because those are 2 cavalry units. He took the infantry and he backed it up away from the river. And then he had a 3rd cavalry unit that he put behind it, that he'll be in command of. When the Romans and the Persians saw that he had made space for him, because he's very welcoming. In the Middle East, it's important to be a good host. And there he is. He's being the good host.
Okay.
So when they see that he's made the space for them, they go, okay, let's start crossing. They cross. Okay. In those 3 battles at the 3 wells that they had just fought at night, Khalid's goal was to prevent the Persian army from forming into 1 unit. Here, he does the opposite. Now he's trying to get the Romans and the Persians across in a really large number. So you think he'll attack them when they're small. He waits till there's 50,000 men across. So they outnumber more than 3-1. And then he orders the attack. So Qaqa and Al-Minhal take their cavalry forces and they're going to try and fight their way to the bridge, which of course is unnerving for the Romans and Persians because then they'll be cut into 2. And then he takes his infantry and he runs them up against the Persians and the Romans. And the infantry is mostly just supposed to hold them in place. They're fighting, but it's gentle fighting. They're not being aggressive because he doesn't want his men to suffer losses. Then he takes his cavalry force and he charges it straight at the infantry. The Arab infantry know to make a gap, to make multiple gaps in the line so that the that Khalid's cavalry, when it hits, it'll hit the Romans and Persians. When he hits them, he pushes them back because of the weight of the horses and the men. And then he pulls back. And then the Arab infantry fill the gaps. And once he's pulled away, he turns his cavalry around and he charges again. And again, the Arab infantry makes gaps and boom, he hits them again. And every time he does this, he pushes the Persians and the Romans further and further back. And he's compressing them into a smaller and smaller space. And eventually they can't
صاروا
move.
متقاربين من بعض بشكل كبير. أيوة.
Too close to use their weapons. So when they realize they've been basically trapped, the river behind them is cut off because there's these two cavalry forces fighting their way to the bridge, and they can't swing their weapons anymore, they panic. And when they panic, having 50,000 men turn all at the same time with the goal of stampeding to the river, their bones were breaking. They were being crushed to death. They were trampled. And they begin running towards the river. At that point, of course, Al-Minhal and Kaka have to keep their men from being overrun, but they at the same time fight them. So they're doing this crowd control fight as the Persians and Romans are jumping into the river, and then Khalid with the infantry and the cavalry behind are just attacking them as they retreat. It's a complete catastrophe. Romans and Persians on the other side go into the ford to try to help their comrades get across. The Arab army eventually reaches them and fights them as well. Ultimately, the rest of the Roman and Persian army just run away. They flee from the battlefield. Maybe 70,000 Romans and Persians were captured or killed or severely wounded that day.
ومن الجيش خالد كم قتل؟
150.
150؟
Yeah.
فقط 150؟
Somewhere around there.
غير منطقي هذا الرقم أن أصدق كيف قتل فقط هذا الرقم في مثل هذه المعركة.
And the reason was because Khalid's goal when they were doing the fighting was just to compress them. He wasn't trying to kill them. So they're mostly fighting with their shields and then using their swords to keep the enemy away, or using their spear to keep the enemy away, because the goal was to compress them into this space. And when you think about it, he's just taken their strength, their numerical strength, and turned it into a weakness.
أتخيل أن بعضهم مات غرقا هنا.
Yes, many of them drowned. Most of them were crushed. The Arabs actually killed very few of them. They mostly ended up killing each other by stampeding.
بهذه الصورة التي تخيلتها من حديثك يعني يستحق أن أقول واو هذا نصر عظيم. كيف كافأ نفسه خالد بن الوليد بعد هذه المعركة؟
Okay, so before the battle started, he made a prayer to God. And he said, look, I know I'm going to die here today, and I know we're going to be defeated. But in case we are not defeated, I will go to Mecca and I will pray. Well, they're not defeated. So now he's like, well, I guess I have to do this. So here's what he does. He had been given very strict orders by the Khalifa Abu Bakr to go back to Hira. So he sends the army with the most circuitous way to get back to Hira. So it'll take a long time. And then he grabs some of his best cavalrymen, and by the way, his wife Layla, and they ride through the desert as fast as they can. And they bring many horses so that they can keep switching horses, right? So that they don't kill their horses by exhausting them. They ride all the way to Mecca. They pull hoods up over their faces so they can be disguised. They pray at the Kaaba, and then they jump on the horses and they ride as fast as they can.
ذهبوا إلى العمرة في مكة. كافأوا نفسهم في العمرة في مكة. العمرة أو الحج.
That was the reward. Yes, exactly. And then
وهل كان الخليفة أبو بكر يعني على علم واطلاع بهذا الأمر وسمح لهم بهذه الخطوة أم كانت بدون علم الأمير؟
His orders were to go to Hira, not to do this. So when Khalid gets back, he arrives at the back of his army just as the army is arriving at Hira. So he thinks he's gotten away with it. A few weeks later, a letter arrives from the Khalifa saying, you were spotted in Mecca, don't disobey my orders again.
رضي الله عن الجميع. أريد أن أنتقل إلى معركة مهمة أيضا من معارك خالد بن الوليد، معركة اليرموك. دعني أنظر إلى هذا المقطع ثم نكمل الحديث. معركة اليرموك في العام 636 للميلاد أنهت وجود الروم البيزنطيين للأبد في بلاد الشام. صف لي حكاية هذه المعركة بأيامها الستة.
Yeah, so what happens is after arriving at Hira, Abu Bakr orders Khalid to go to Syria. So Abu Bakr had already sent a group of armies into Syria, but they hadn't had any successes. They hadn't actually captured any Roman territory. So he's hoping that Khalid could come in there and start the process of conquering. But when you think about this for a moment, you realize there's something really amazing going on. So the Persian Empire was around for 1,200 years. The Romans had been building an empire, originally as a republic, but then later they called themselves an empire, for almost 900 years by this point. So the Roman Empire was this well-established institution, this super powerful institution. Abu Bakr is ordering his armies within 3 years of having unified the Arabs to attack both empires at the same time. A normal human being would attack the weaker of the two, conquer it, and then use the resources from that to attack the other one. But a normal human being wouldn't have thought either was possible. And he's doing both at the same time. So at some level, these men are thinking in ways that I don't think we can comprehend today. Because how could you have the confidence that this would even work? So,
برأيك ما هو مصدر الثقة التي أبو بكر ورجاله يفكرون فيها بأن يفتحوا جبهتين مع دولتين عظميين في ذات الوقت؟ ما هي القوة الكبيرة التي تدفع خلف هذه الثقة العالية برأيك؟
So you could make the argument that it's religious zeal, because for sure there was that. I think, for example, Khalid wasn't afraid to die because he believed, right? And there's the best soldiers are the ones that aren't afraid to die, because they put themselves in the position where they're killing the enemy.
تأكيدا لكلامك، كان هناك مقولة تقال عند الجيش المسلمين أنه يصفهم أحدهم أنهم هؤلاء رجال يحبون الموت كما يحب الجنود على الضفة الآخر الحياة.
Right.
أكمل كلامك في اليرموك.
But then there's a little bit of an argument against that, because dead soldiers are very terrible soldiers. They don't kill many people when they're dead. In other words, it's great to have a soldier who's not afraid of death, but it's not great to have a soldier who does die. And so, in other words, the religious zeal gave them power, but it doesn't explain what they were doing. They were doing something that went beyond just simply, I'm not afraid to die because I know that God is going to take care of me. They were doing something that, because let's say you were worried about your religion, you might want to be defensive and then protect your borders and not let the Romans and the Persians attack you. Because that could have also been your answer. Their answer went past that. And at some level, it's just so extraordinary, I can't wrap my mind around it. It's too much. So Khalid crosses the desert. He breaks the rules. He doesn't follow the Euphrates. That would have been the natural way to go to Syria. He cuts through the desert. He eventually captures Damascus. And so they've now got real estate in Syria. And at that point, a letter arrives from the new Khalifa, and that's Umar ibn al-Khattab, and he demotes Khalid and takes away his command and hands it to Abu Ubaid. So Abu Ubaid is in charge. They go and they actually take homes, and they're settling into how much of Syria they're going to try and take before they move to Palestine. And word arrives. There are 4 really big Roman armies coming. By really big, one of those Roman armies is the size of the entire Arab army in Syria. So they're outnumbered 4-1. That's the word. And so at that point, Abu Ubaidah goes, wow, I don't know how we get through this. So he brings his generals together and he says, okay, we need to make a decision here. Who here wants Khalid ibn al-Walid to be in command? And he raises his hand.
يعني سيتنازل أبو عبيدة لخالد بن الوليد بالقيادة.
Yes.
لماذا؟
And then
Why? لماذا؟
he believes that Khalid can see combat in a way that a normal human being can't. That he'll get them through this. And so Abu Ubaidah says, I want Khalid in charge. Who else agrees with me? And everybody agrees with him. And so he said, Khalid's like, I don't want to be in charge. You're in charge. And he goes, no, we voted. You're in charge. But Abu Ubaidah says, I'm the official commander, so I take all the responsibility. If we're defeated, that's my fault. But I want Khalid to make the decisions. So he's in charge. First thing, so they're like, what are our orders? First thing Khalid says, we have to return the jizya. We have to return the taxes.
لماذا؟ لماذا يعيدون الجزية؟
So a normal army would say the first thing we need to do is prepare for battle, or get supplies, or move to a new location, build a fort. His first action is to return the taxes because he says, if we die with the taxes, the Romans will plunder the money, and the money won't be returned to the people we taxed. We taxed them because we were going to give them government services. We were going to be in charge of them. So we will have stolen their money. And if we're going to lose, we need to lose with honor. We need to lose with dignity. We need to lose as people who did the right thing.
يعني هذا القرار بناء على قاعدة أخلاقية ليست قاعدة عسكرية.
It's completely an ethical principle. It has no military value whatsoever. And then and of course everybody's like, well, what are you talking about? So he says, if we win, we'll come back and take the taxes. But this way we can die honest. We can die as honest men. And so they agree. They return the taxes. I don't know of any army that's ever done anything like that. An army that thought, we might not win. How do we want to be remembered as losers? No, who does that? It's remarkable. It shows a level of ethical behavior. So if you wanted to know who Khalid was, I think that's the moment right there. There might be another moment, but that one definitely, I think, describes him. So then the next thing they say is, okay, now what do we do? So he goes, the Romans are going to have a really hard time if all four armies are in one place. So let's not fight them separately. We're going to fight them as one army. So again, it's the opposite of what he did when he did the night attack.
محاولة تفريق الجيوش الأربعة يعني.
Yeah. Instead of trying to attack the Romans in four separate armies, he wants to bring them all together in one place because he knows it'll put a strain on the Roman supply system and their economy. So he takes all the Arab armies that are scattered in Palestine and Syria and he orders them to go to one spot in southern Syria. And that spot, of course, is Yarmouk. They get there. Yarmouk has two canyons, one on the west and one in the south. And then Khalid parks his army perpendicular to the southern canyon on the eastern end. So there's a space in between the two canyons and his army. And his hope, of course, is that the Romans will go into that space because when they do, they can't retreat south because of the canyon. West would be a problem because there's a bridge, but the bridge is small, so you'd only get a few troops across at a time. So the only way to go would be north or east through his army. So he's kind of made a cup-shaped trap. The Romans, of course, don't think twice about this because they believe there's no way that he can beat them. There's probably right about 120,000 Romans and about 30,000 Arabs. So they're outnumbered 4-1. The Romans, by the way, are multiple. So there are Romans in the traditional sense, like in the video it showed Romans with red uniforms. There were those Romans. There were Romans that were ethnically Greek. They weren't Italians. There were Germans. The Lombards had shown up. There were Avars, who were the people that lived at the time in what is today Bulgaria, and they were the fiercest enemies of the Romans. They hated them, but the Romans paid them. There were Arabs. There were Lahmid Arabs. There were Christian Arabs. And there were Turks. The Turks were fighting for the Romans at this time as mercenaries. And so the Roman army is this multi-ethnic army with different fighting styles. And the commander is Prince Vahan. He's an Armenian. And that's actually interesting because the emperor's brother, Theodore, had been the commander of the Syria-Palestine territory of the Roman Empire up until Ajnadain. And then after the defeat there, he was recalled back to Constantinople, where he was humiliated in public, tortured in public, and then executed by the emperor's son. So the son murders his uncle in public. So now Vahan's in charge. Khalid shows up, the Romans show up and they occupy that space. Vahan actually sent an embassy to talk to Khalid, and Khalid was like, there's nothing to talk about, what would we do? So they're going to have the battle. Khalid had divided his army into 4 infantry units. The one on the right flank, so on the northern end, was going to be commanded by Amr ibn al-As. Then Shurahbil had the center right. The center left was Abu Ubaidah, and then the far left was Yazid ibn Abi Sufyan. And then behind that, Khalid put 2 cavalry units. And then he had a 3rd cavalry unit that was like the strategic reserve cavalry unit that he would be in direct command of in the back. And then behind that is where most of the women were and the supply train and the remaining animals, like the supply animals. Having said that, he did have, and the video we just showed, there were some women who did take up a combat role. And of course, the most famous of it was Khalwa bint Azwar. She actually created the unit. It wasn't an especially large unit.
يعني النساء شاركوا في القتال في هذه المعركة بشكل مباشر.
They had women with armor and swords and shields who fought directly in the fight. And this scene we just saw showed that. In fact, the first woman that was fighting was Khawla. But at this point, he has her in reserve. He hasn't committed her to the fight. So the first day, Vahan wants to test. He wants to feel out what the Arab army is like. And so he just gently moves his army forward. There's light fighting. It lasts throughout the day. The Romans built a tower behind the army so that Vahan could be in the top and he could look out across the field and evaluate the fight. And so the fighting lasts for hours. Eventually Vahan calls the army back, the Romans back up, they disengage.
يعني في اليوم الأول لم يكن يعني هناك حدث مؤثر، اشتباكات بسيطة لجس النبض إن صح التعبير.
Just a light attack. Very few people get killed. There's some injuries for sure, but you know, it's for 120,000 men and 30,000 men, there should have been a lot of casualties, but he doesn't want to do that. He's doing a probing attack. Day 2, he's not going to do a probing attack. He takes the Roman right and the Roman left. Sorry, the Roman left and the Roman right. And he attacks the Arab right and the Arab left as hard as he can. And they're outnumbered 4-1. The middle is holding. The flanks are starting to crumble under the pressure. And as the fighting goes on over the course of the day, and the Arabs keep getting pushed further and further back, there's a problem for the guys in the middle, right? Because now the Romans are starting to flank the guys in the middle. They're holding their ground, but the situation is getting dangerous. And then the Arab flanks start to break. The pressure on the Arabs was just too great. They're taking heavy losses, their morale shatters, and they start to run. And they're running back. And the battle will end in disaster if they keep doing this. The women back at the supply train that weren't combatants pull the tent stakes out from the tents and charge towards the Arab men. And they shout poetry at them, most of it insulting poetry. And some of the women say, "You're going to die today. Your choice is, we kill you, you die by the hands of your wives, or the Romans kill you."
يعني كان هناك شحن معنوي حاد من قبل النساء للرجال في الثبات في المعركة.
Yeah. And the men thought about it and they thought, yeah, it'll be better to die at the hands of the Romans. So they turn around and they rally and they start fighting. At that point, Khalid releases the 2 cavalry units that were there. The one on Yazid's side isn't as effective, but the one on Amr ibn al-As's side works very well. And then he takes the strategic reserve and he comes around and they put so much pressure on that Roman flank, it eventually starts to back up. At that point, Khalid brings the strategic reserve around the backside to deal with the Romans on Yazid's side. And by the end of the day, after hours and hours and hours of fighting, they're back where they started.
هذا في اليوم الثاني.
That's second day.
ولم يحدث فارق في اليوم الثاني. ماذا حدث في اليوم الثالث؟
Okay, so the third day, Prince Vahan decides it's Amr ibn al-As's side that he's going to attack. He's not going to attack the other flank. But this time, instead of just attacking the furthest core army, he's going to attack the 2 armies. So he attacks Shirahbil's army as well. And they put enormous strain again on the army. And the Arab army starts to break again. And the women charge again. And by this point, the small women unit is in the fight. And it's a desperate situation, but the men rally because they realize they don't want to die at the hands of their wives. And they turn around and they come back and they start pushing. And then that's at that point that Khalid again releases his cavalry units. And the cavalry units, little by little, begin to push back. And eventually they get back to where they started the day. At that point, on day 2, a Roman general named Derjan dies. And that was bad for morale. But the real thing that was tearing up the Roman morale is that on day 2 and day 3, the battle ends where it started.
معناته مرور الوقت من صالح الجيش خالد ويحمل ضغط كبير بحكم كبر العدد على جيش ماهان أو باهان في رواية أخرى.
Yeah, so yeah, exactly right. Vahan has the numerical superiority, but somehow Khalid keeps prevailing, and every time it does, it works for Khalid's side because the morale of the Romans keeps sinking because they can't understand why they can't win. How is this possible? The Arabs are on the brink of defeat, and they pull it out, and they push back. When things are in absolute despair, they push back. At this point, too, another thing is affecting Roman morale. Reinforcements are showing up. So how impossible would it have been to launch reinforcements from Medina, to time them so they would arrive at the Battle of Yarmouk, but also to arrive at the Battle of Yarmouk? Like, how much coordination did they have to do to be able to get the reinforcement to even arrive in the right place, let alone the right time? But they're showing up, and they're not huge. We're talking 1,000 here, 1,000 there. But it's affecting the Roman morale because they're seeing these new guys come, and they spread it out. So instead of them coming all at once, it's this constant trickle. And, the Romans are looking at this constant trickle thinking, how many are coming? And there are big names. For example, Abu Sufyan and his wife Hind are amongst these that are showing up. Abdul Rahman ibn Abi Bakr was at the battle, but Abdul Rahman ibn Khalid ibn al-Welid is one of the guys that shows up. So now there's this cadre of people that are in the fight for day 4.
وأين كان التحول؟ في أي يوم حدث التحول الكبير؟ هل كان هناك مفاوضات في وسط هذه المعارك أو استمر القتال دون مفاوضات؟
It's continuing without negotiation up all the way into day 4.
ماذا حدث في اليوم الخامس أو السادس؟
Well, let me tell you what happens on the 4th day. They do this. Vahan does the same thing on the same flank against Amr ibn al-As and Shirahbil. This time it doesn't break, but on the other flank, the Romans are launching arrows, and a lot of people get blinded or lose an eye during the day, including Abu Sufyan. He loses an eye that day. Okay, so that day ends right where the other 2 did. Despite the Roman numerical superiority. So you asked what happened on day 5. So on day 5, a Roman, by himself, one Roman, walks into the middle of the battlefield, and he approaches the Arab army. And of course, the Arab army is like, what's this guy doing? This is this one guy. And he says, I'm here to negotiate. So they take him all the way.
المفاوضات.
Yes. And they take him all the way to the back where the strategic reserve is. And Khalid sees him, and he puts out a mat, and they bring dates. And they bring some food, and they set it up, and the Roman sits down, and Khalid sits down, and they start negotiating. And, you know, the Roman is saying, what if we give you Palestine and we keep Syria? And, like, it's that kind of negotiating. And, you know, we'll let you take all the plunder you've already taken. We won't, because when they move south, they abandon Damascus and Homs. The Romans have retaken those cities. So they're like, you know, this could be the border right here. And Khalid is entertaining the guy. But then Khalid starts to talk about other things. He's talking about the weather and, you know, how nice things have been lately. And the Roman, after hours of negotiating, asks, you're not negotiating with me anymore, are you? And Khalid goes, no, of course not. He goes, what did you waste my time for? He said, I'm a host.
ليش أخذت مني كل هذا الوقت وأنت ما تفاوض؟ أنت ضيف بس.
Exactly. Exactly.
ماذا حدث في اليوم السادس والأخير؟
Khalid understood that the only reason the Romans would send a negotiator was they were broken, that their hearts were broken, that they were no longer in the fight. So he took all of the cavalry and he put it on the right flank behind Amr ibn al-As. He ordered his men to attack the Romans. When in human history does the smaller force attack the larger force? The infantry rides up and attacks. In the meantime, he takes his cavalry and he swings it around through the open space to the north, and he comes in behind the Roman army. When the infantry had attacked, the Roman cavalry committed and charged in to help the Roman infantry. So when Khaled's leading the cavalry, when the cavalry comes in, there's no Roman cavalry to respond. The Roman cavalry realizes what's happening, but it's too late. So as they're peeling off to go approach, by that point, the whole Roman left flank is crumbling under the pressure of, they're being attacked on every side. Infantry on one side, cavalry on the other side. It's devastating. Once that starts to unfold, the Roman cavalry is defeated. It becomes clear to the Romans that the battle is over, and they begin to break and run. A group of them run west towards the bridge. The problem was during the night, Khalid had sent men to capture the bridge. So when the Romans arrive, there's already a group of Arabs waiting for them, and they just become prisoners. Some Romans take off north, and they do escape, including Prince Vahan. He manages to go north. His goal, of course, is to get to Damascus, but Khalid decides to pursue him, and he did have some soldiers with him. Khalid's soldiers defeat the Roman soldiers that were with Prince Vahan, but the Khalid soldiers have strict instructions not to hurt Prince Vahan. And then, after there's one man standing, Khalid goes up to him and he says, you are a warrior, and you deserve a warrior's death. I will not let you suffer at the hands of Emperor Heraclius. I am here to give you your death. And they fight one-on-one.
قاتلا رجل لرجل.
Yes. And Khalid does kill him in the end, and that's how Prince Vahan dies.
وقتل باهان في تلك المعركة أو في تلك الواقعة.
Yes.
في الجزء الأخير من هذا السياق أريد أن أستعرض معك حدث مختلف، وهو تسليم بيت المقدس. دعنا نشاهد هذا المقطع الذي سيكون هو الجزء الأخير من هذه الرواية.
هذا هو الذي وصف لنا. تفتح مدينة الرب على يديه على جمل أحمر، وعلى رأسه عباءة قطوانية، ويرتدي ثوبا مرقعا. سنعقد معه الأمان. هذا والرب صاحب محمد بن عبد الله. نسألك العهد والأمان أيها الفاروق عمر.
الحمد لله والشكر لله ولا إله إلا الله. الله أكبر.
فتح القدس من أهم الأحداث التاريخية التي حدثت وشارك فيها خالد بن الوليد. ما هي الرواية التي تظن أنها حدثت من وجهة نظرك؟
Okay, so the Arab army arrives, and they have a really big problem. Jerusalem has springs inside it. It's a walled-off city. It's got a citadel, and then there's also the wall for the city. So there's a fortress within the city. The city itself is a fortress. There were actually some farm fields inside the city so they could grow some supplemental food, but they have food stored. So a siege against Jerusalem could literally last a year, 2 years, and that's longer than you want to do a siege because, you've got an army in the desert. It has to run its water supply to the Jordan River. You've got to send it food. It's going to be complicated to stay, but they have to take the city. So weeks turn into months. They're stuck waiting for the city to go. The Romans had mostly abandoned the city because they thought they would win Yarmouk. It didn't occur to them that they were going to need to defend it. The whole time, Sophronius, he's the archbishop that was featured here in this clip. Sophronius kept sending word to Emperor Heraclius, please send assistance. We need to lift the siege. I need your help. Send military aid. And Heraclius has a problem. His army that he sent to do this is already destroyed. He doesn't really have the means to help the city. And so it becomes clear to Sophronius.
بذكر هرقل أتذكر مقولة لهرقل لما شاهد جيشه مهزوما بعد معركة اليرموك، ودع سوريا هذا البلد الجميل وقال وداعا إلى الأبد بعد معركة اليرموك، بعد أن رأى أن جيشه انتهى، فهو لماذا يغامر في القدس؟
That's exactly right. Yeah, he goes to Antioch and he says, yeah, farewell to Syria. You've been a wonderful province for Rome. May you be a wonderful province for your new masters. And he goes to Constantinople. He's given up. And so Sophronius finally figures it out. He's on his own. It's over. So Sophronius sends word to the Arab army, look, I'm ready to negotiate terms, but I have to do it with the Khalifa, Umar ibn al-Khattab. I will not do it with anybody else.
لا يريد التفاوض إلا مع عمر بن الخطاب، لا يريد التفاوض مع أحد آخر.
Exactly. And so there's a discussion that the generals have, and somebody points out that Khalid is Omar's cousin. That this could work, that he could replace, that they could pretend that this is the Khalifa. And so Abu Ubaidah goes, no, I think this is a terrible mistake. We shouldn't do this. But after they talk it out, their problem is they don't want to send word all the way back to Medina, and then they're going to bring the Khalifa all the way. It's going to take forever. And so they finally talk Abu Ubaidah into doing this. So they pretend that Khalid is the Khalifa. He approaches the wall, and Sophronius is standing on the wall, but there's a Roman standing next to Sophronius who had seen Khalid before and whispers to Sophronius, no, this is Khalid. Sophronius is furious. He's outraged, and he shouts at the men down below, and he tells them, "Look, I know you tried to trick me. I will not negotiate until the Khalifa arrives." So they have to send word to Medina and bring the Khalifa. So eventually, he arrives, and he's leading a camel, and there's a man on top of the camel riding the camel, and Sophronius comes out. Because he doesn't know where the Khalifa is. He just sees there's a group of people, there's a group of men coming.
إنه وفد عمر وصل، وفد الخليفة عمر وصل.
Exactly, that's all he knows.
لكن لا يعرف كيف البروتوكول المتبع عند المسلمين العرب. Okay.
And so he gets in his lectica, the couch that you ride in Roman times, and men carry you. And so there's like 6 or 8 men carrying him, and he's got his big red hat, and he's wearing red silk robe, and he has the gold tassels hanging, and he's got gold jewelry. And they carry him out of the city, and he approaches this new entourage of Arabs coming. And he looks up at the guy riding the camel, and he says, "Where is the leader of the Arabs?" And the guy riding the camel gestures to the man leading the camel.
الذي راكب فوق الجمل يشير على الذي يمسك بالجمل.
Yes. And so Sophronius goes, "Oh, okay, do you know where the Khalifa is?" Sophronius is an Arab. He's a Christian Arab with Roman citizenship. So he's speaking to him in Arabic. He's like, "Do you know where the Khalifa is?" And the man leading the camel says, "I'm the Khalifa." He's a plain dressed man. He's not covered in gold. He's not wearing dyed red silk robes. And Sophronius can't comprehend this because the Roman emperor wears, purple silk and he's covered in gold. And he goes, "Wait, you're the leader of the Arabs who have conquered us." And some of the Arab soldiers had chainmail and they had nice clothing and fantastic horses. And here's the ruler of the Arabs, a humbly dressed man leading a camel.
يعني حتى ما ركب على الجمل يعني هو.
He's not even riding the camel. So Sophronius goes, "Wait, you're the guy? Why aren't you riding the camel?" And Omar ibn al-Khattab says, "I only own one camel, and this is my assistant. It was his turn to ride. We take turns riding." And Sophronius can't believe what he's hearing. Like, I have 8 men carry me, and you're letting your assistant ride the camel? So they turn the lectica around, and Omar ibn al-Khattab is heading towards the gate. And Sophronius says, I'm here to negotiate the surrender terms. The Khalifa says, "Let me tell you what I'm thinking, and then you tell me if you agree." And the Khalifa says, "I want all the Roman politicians to leave. They can leave with whatever they can carry." So just the bureaucrats, just the top leadership of the city, not the religious leadership, but the political leadership. And that's it.
فقط. لا يريد شيء آخر.
That's it.
سلمون المدينة وهؤلاء فقط اللي يغادرون بما يحملونه فقط.
And Sophronius goes, "Wait, what about plundering the city? I was here to negotiate on violence that you do to the people as you're plundering the city. I was here to make it so that you didn't enslave people." And the Khalifa goes, "Why would I do these things? I'm here to take Jerusalem as peacefully as possible. I don't want to hurt anybody if I can. In the process, you're surrendering. Why would we?" And Sophronius goes, "Because Romans would. The Romans would plunder your city. If the tables were turned, we would take your goods and your gold and your land." And the Khalifa goes, "No, we're not that way." So then at that point, Sophronius says, "Well, I surrender the city. There's nothing to negotiate. There's no these are the simplest terms. Of course, I accept them." So when they arrive at the gate, Sophronius signals for the gate to be opened. They go into the city, and Sophronius turns to the Khalifa and says, "If this is such a peaceful event, I would love to commemorate it by you coming to my church and you pray in your Muslim style, and I'll pray in my Christian style." And the Khalifa says no.
رفض.
No.
لماذا؟
He says, "If I pray in your church, in the future Muslims are going to go, this is the first place in Jerusalem the Khalifa prayed in, and they'll take your church from you and turn it into a mosque."
وسيصادروا الكنيسة ويحولونها إلى مسجد. Okay.
So Sophronius goes, "The church owns an empty plot. It's just an open, there's no buildings. Why don't we go there and pray?" And Omar ibn al-Khattab goes, "Okay, let's do it." And they pray at the same time. And that spot today has a mosque commemorating the first place that the Khalifa prayed. That church is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's the holiest church in Christianity. And it's still under Christian control today. At that point, the Khalifa says, "I want to see the city, and I want you to show me the Jewish community." And Sophronius goes, "There's no Jews in Jerusalem." And the Khalifa goes, what do you mean? This is a city that's holy for Jews. How can there be no Jews here? And so Sophronius has to explain, well, when the Persians and the Romans had fought each other, the Jews had sided with the Persians. So Theodore, the emperor's brother, when he took command of the city from the Persians, he waited a year or two, but he began massacring the Jews. He slaughtered thousands of Jews and drove them out of the city. And so Omar turns to a convert from Judaism. He was a Jewish Yemenis who became a Muslim and said, I want you to go find 80 families and you bring them here and you put them in the city because there needs to be Jews in Jerusalem. This city is holy to Jews too. They have to have a share. And then he goes, okay, I want to see the Temple Mount. And Sophronius goes, why would you want to see that? And the Khalifa goes, because it's holy. What? It's where the second temple of Solomon was until the Romans destroyed it. And Sophronius goes, yes, but the Jews wouldn't stop rebelling. They kept throwing rocks at Roman soldiers and fighting Roman soldiers. And they would attack them in the street, or they would kill them every chance they got. And so to punish them, we desecrated the Temple Mount. And the Khalifa goes, show me. And he gets there, and there's garbage all over the Temple Mount. They had put 400 years of waste on top of the Temple Mount to just desecrate it and ruin it. And the Khalifa can't believe it, so he begins picking up the garbage. When the Arab army, which had been following him into the city, sees this, they rush up and they begin clearing the Temple Mount of the garbage. And in the process, they find a chain and a stone that they believed was from the second temple of Solomon, and so they preserve those, and the rest of it is pushed off.
كيف كانت نهاية خالد بن الوليد العسكرية؟ الوقت بدأ يضيق معي وأريد أن أستعجل أكثر بالحديث بعد إذنك.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
كيف كانت نهاية مسيرة خالد بن الوليد العسكرية؟ النهاية كيف كانت؟ هو لم يقتل.
No, he wasn't killed. So after they won Yarmouk, Abu Ubaidah took command again. So it was just for that one battle that they let him be in charge. From that point on, for 2 or 3 more battles, Khalid served as Abu Ubaidah's advisor. Abu Ubaidah took the Arab army and he broke it up. Amr ibn al-As had his own command and sent them here and there. But Khalid stayed with Abu Ubaidah and served as advisor. They capture Homs, and when they capture it, at that point, Khalifa Omar ibn al-Khattab says, no, he's not just demoted, he's fired. He's no longer in the military, and he removes him completely. So at that point, Khalid turns to his wife and his 2 sons, Abdul Rahman and Muhajir, and he says, I like Homs. Do you guys, maybe we could just live here? They find a house that was abandoned by the Romans, and they move in. And eventually Muawiyah becomes the governor of Syria. And when he does, he appoints Abdul Rahman ibn Khalid ibn al-Walid to become the governor of Homs. And so the family settles in. They get a nice position for the oldest son. Khalid will die in 642 at roughly the age of 50. He was probably right about 50 years old. It's not...
مات صغيرا يعني لم يعمر طويلا.
Yeah, I mean, 6 years after Yarmouk. So he was, in his 40s when he was out there fighting. And he says, there isn't a place you can put a hand on my body and you wouldn't touch a scar. And here I am in bed dying like a cow.
أريد أن أستعرض معك رأي يقول وأستمع إلى رأيك المضاد لهذا الرأي المقول إن كنت تتفق أو تختلف معه. دعنا نرى ماذا يقول هذا الرأي.
ولهذا يجب أن نعيد النظر في أوضاعنا وأن ندرك أن تخلفنا في داخلنا وليس من خارجنا. تخلفنا في داخلنا في رؤوسنا، في عواطفنا، في طريقة تفكيرنا، في انتفاشنا. يعني نحن دائما نتحدث عن الآخرين بأنهم يحسدون على ما نحن فيه. يحسدون على ماذا؟ على التخلف؟ يحسدون على التعصب؟ يحسدون على الجهل؟ الآن عندما نراجع الإنجازات البشرية التي حصلت في مجال الطب والهندسة والطيران وفي كل المجالات، ما الذي قدمناه نحن العرب خلال قرنين كاملين؟ ما الذي قدمناه؟ يقولون قدموا أسلافنا. الواقع ليس، حتى أسلافنا لم يقدموا. الذين قدموا كانوا أفرادا خارج النسق الثقافي العربي. ابن رشد، ابن الهيثم، ابن النفيس، كل هؤلاء كانوا خارج النسق الثقافي. والحكم على الغالب، الحكم على الراجح، على الثقافة السائدة، وليس على أفراد خارج النسق الثقافي. وحتى هؤلاء الذين كانوا متميزين كأفراد أيضا كانوا تلامذة على الفكر اليوناني. نتغنى دائما بأن الغرب مدين لنا، وأنه لولا ما أخذه منا لما تقدم. وهذه خديعة كبرى خدرت عقولنا وخدرت عقول أجيالنا، وبقينا نكرر ونردد هذه المقولة السخيفة. نزعم بأن الغرب أخذ من ابن رشد ومن ابن الهيثم وغيره، لكن ابن رشد كان عندنا منبوذا وأحرقت كتبه، فكيف نفخر بمن نبذناه نحن؟ إن هذه مهزلة من مهازلنا.
هل تتفق أو تختلف مع كلام المفكر والمثقف إبراهيم البليهي في حديثه عن الحضارة العربية والإسلامية؟
So I had a little bit of difficulty hearing the translation as it was going. So my understanding was that he was saying
هو يقول يعني لم نؤثر، العرب والمسلمون لم يؤثروا في الحضارة الإسلامية، وليس لهم وجود في الحضارة العالمية، وأنه هي محاولات فردية، لكن لا يوجد حالة حضارية قدمها العرب والمسلمون، وليس أحد مدين لنا بهذه الحضارة، لا الغرب ولا غيره. تعليقك.
So there was a moment in my wife's academic career where she told a professor when she was a student that one of her goals was to dive deeply into Islamic philosophy. And the professor said, "Is there such a thing?" So there is this common theme that runs to today in academic circles, at least, that there is no such thing as Muslim philosophy or.
أنا أريد رأيك أنت، أين تقع الحضارة الإسلامية، الحضارة العربية الإسلامية بين الحضارات إن كانت موجودة؟
So it is one of the most important, and I'll tell you exactly why. So the Romans destroyed the Great Library in 391 or 392 AD. When they did that, it was absolutely catastrophic for the world because the knowledge and the information that was contained in the Great Library was irreplaceable. The Romans then began burning other libraries. So they were burning copies that were outside of the Great Library. And if they had continued to do this, we would have lost Plato and Aristotle. We would have lost all these incredible Roman and Egyptian and Greek thinkers, Euclid. We would have lost Aristophanes, Sophocles. There was so much information that was being destroyed. We got lucky as a planet because there were a group of Romans who escaped with as many books as they could and took them to Gondi Shapur. Jondi Sabur. Gondi Shapur is what it was called by the Persians. The Persians today, by the way, say Jondi because they've taken the Arabic pronunciation, but the original was Gondi. So at Gondi Shapur, there was an academy, and they took all that Greek and Egyptian and Roman material and they put it in that academy where there was already a bunch of Persian, Indian, and Chinese material. When the Arabs conquered the Persian Empire, they captured Gondi Shapur, they realized that academy was something extraordinary. So, how many times has a conqueror come and just burnt something because they didn't understand what it was? But the Arabs had the opposite attitude. They said, no, this is something really special. We need to take care of it. Even though they couldn't comprehend it, right? They didn't know philosophy. They didn't know how to read it. But it took a little bit more than 100 years, and they did begin to read it. We get Al-Kindi, we get Khwarazmi, and that's the start of what will become one of the most important periods of technological development and philosophy, science, mathematics. They will change the world in the path that we're on. I'll give you some examples. Between 750 and 800, the Arabs invented modern agriculture. That included all sorts of innovations, including using water wheels to power granaries, including creating dams to have irrigation at higher altitudes so you could get more land that you could cultivate. It included crop rotation. It included having heterogeneous farms instead of having homogeneous farms, so that if something happened to a crop, it wouldn't take out the whole farm. It would just take out that section of the farm.
وكانت هذه الحضارة تقريبا بين أي قرن وأي قرن ذروة الحضارة الإسلامية العربية اللي تتحدث عنها. في القرن التاسع العاشر.
So the peak for what they create, it really starts around 750, and Arab civilization probably peaked in the 11th century, but it's still producing material well past that. It doesn't stop.
على هذا الحديث أنت تتكلم عن يعني لا تتكلم عن عدد محدود من السنوات أو العقود، أنت تتكلم عن مجموع عن قرون من الحضارة.
Centuries.
ولذلك أين هذا التاريخ؟ هل لم يكتب؟ هل هناك تجاهل لهذا التاريخ؟ هل هذا التجاهل هو صدفة أم هو تجاهل متعمد؟ برأيك؟
So some of it's on purpose, some of it is maybe an accident, some of it is theft of ideas. So some of it they couldn't help but accept it as it was. Like what Al-Khwarazmi does is he invents algebra, the Arabic numerals, right? And so we end up with a brand new math system. They import it, they give credit. And then they try to pronounce his name, they mispronounce it, it comes out algorithm. So every time we say algorithm, we're saying Al-Khwarazmi's name. But then there's material that comes later that is clearly the Arabs are being written out. Ibn al-Haytham created the scientific method. It wasn't Francis Bacon, it wasn't Galileo Galilei. It was an 11th century philosopher who was originally from Basra, but was doing his work in Cairo. And he wrote the Book of Optics. He's the guy who came up with the scientific method 600 years before Bacon.
في حديث لم يكن بعيدا من هذه الأيام التي نحن فيها، قال فيها ولي العهد السعودي أن الشرق الأوسط سيكون هو أوروبا الجديدة. هذا التصريح ليس تصريحا سياسيا وفقط، هو تكلم على تصريح حضاري. هل يمكن أن يكون الشرق الأوسط هو مركزا جديدا للحضارة العالمية برأيك؟
Yeah, definitely. So if you look at all the innovations that the world has had, agriculture comes from here. Writing comes from here. The world's first government comes from here. The first written laws come from here. The world's first ever Bill of Rights. The Persians did it. Cyrus the Great did it. And then the Great Library was in Alexandria. The Gondi Shapur was in Persia. The Middle East has always been at the center of cultural, technological, scientific, philosophical innovation. Thales, the world's first ever philosopher, he started philosophy in Miletos. Miletos is in what is today Turkey. He wasn't Greek. He was Phoenician. He was writing in Greek because he lived in a Greek majority city. It was a Greek colony. But at the end of the day, the Middle East has always been at the center of this. When I said, the Arabs invented modern agriculture, they also...
هذا من ناحية التاريخ، ولكن أنا أتكلم عنك هل من الممكن أن يكون في المستقبل؟
Absolutely. So it is the aberration for the Middle East not to be a major player in the development of the world. It's only the last 400 years. In other words, out of the last 12,000 years, the Middle East has played a major role in developing technology and culture and science for all but 400. When I look around today, so I've been traveling the Arabian Gulf lately. What I see is hope and amazing leadership. And that amazing leadership, I think, could deliver on that promise. When I hear the Crown Prince say this, I think this is possible.
ممكن.
It is possible. Look, the Arab world has serious challenges. Multiple states are in turmoil. There's not always great leadership in some parts of the Arab world. But right now in Saudi Arabia, in UAE, Qatar, I see really strong, solid leadership. I think if Arabs can put aside their differences and start to act more cooperatively and bank on this, I can't comprehend what I'm seeing. I think there is a very distinct future, a wonderful future.
زميلي عبد الله جابر راسم كاريكاتير، وأريد أن أشاهد معك هذا الكاريكاتير ونختم في هذا اللقاء إن أذنت لي. دعنا نشاهد هذا الكاريكاتير معا. لماذا تضحك؟ زواج سري، وهذه الممرضة تقول أهلا جاك، وهذا المهندس يلبس قبعة أو خوذة أرامكو. يذكرك بشيء هذه الكاريكاتير؟
A little bit, yes.
والدك مهندس أمريكي عاملة في أرامكو، ووالدتك ممرضة وأيضا عملت في مستشفى أرامكو.
That's correct.
تزوج بالسر. اكشف لنا سر هذه القصة.
Yes. Yes. Okay, so my parents were working here in the 60s. My father was the guy who they would take the data and he would interpret where the oil fields were. So he was the guy who would say, drill here, don't drill there. And my mother was part of Saudi Arabia's vaccination program. And the two of them met and they fell in love really fast, really quickly. But Aramco at the time had a rule that you couldn't be a married couple and work for it. So they got married secretly in Lebanon, and then they kept their separate apartments so that they could pretend they weren't married. And my mother.
لماذا؟ يعني لماذا لم يظهر زواجهما؟
Well, because then one of them would have had to quit their job, and so to keep both of them working, they secretly were married. And then my mother went to Lebanon to give birth to me, and when Aramco found out, they made my father pick which one would quit, and my father said we both quit and we moved to the United States.
نحن سعيدان جدا بهذا الحوار معك، وكنت أمتد كنت أطمع إلى مزيد من الوقت حتى أتحدث بأمور أخرى، لكن للأسف انتهى وقتي هنا. شكرا لقدومك إلى السعودية لإجراء هذا الحوار.
Thank you so much for bringing me.
الشكر موصول لكم أنتم. وانقلوا عن روي كاساغراندا أنه يقول خالد بن الوليد من أعظم 3 محاربين عبر العصور. السلام عليكم.